The glory of humanity is the differentiation, individuality of each person, and the fact that each individual is unique and irreplaceable, which makes each individual precious.
I'd like to talk to you this afternoon about two classes of Americans, and it may not be the two classes you think of, but nonetheless, there are two distinct classes in America, and we have to break up.
You don't get freedom peacefully. Anyone who is depriving you of freedom isn't deserving of a peaceful approach.
We declare our right on this earth to be a man, to be a human being, to be respected as a human being, to be given the rights of a human being by any means necessary.
Welcome to the Unrestrained Thoughts Podcast, a Utah-based program that focuses on ideas, politics, culture, and the current events going on in the world around us, whether locally or globally. I'm your host, David Iglesias. All right, welcome back, everyone, to the first episode in a long time since I don't even remember at what point last year. But this is the first episode of 2023, and I figured we had a lot of really exciting stuff to talk about this year, especially today we just started our Utah legislative session, and we'll talk more about that. But my guest today is Amy Pomeroy from the Libertas Institute, or Libertas, however you want to pronounce it. Amy, how you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on, David.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you for taking the time to do this. So Amy works on criminal justice policy. Do you want to explain a little bit about what does that mean? What do you do, and kind of your background as far as the work you cover at the Libertas Institute?
Yeah, sure. So that's a great question. So I've only been here at Libertas under a year. Before that, I was a prosecutor for a county. So I, looked at all the cases and brought them to trial or negotiated them. And doing that, I got to see really up close what's working with our criminal justice system and what isn't working. And I wanted to no longer be, just a cog in the machine. I wanted to actually be part of making that system better. And so I came to Libertas.
Okay, awesome. And how did you find Libertas?
I've been interested in Libertas's work from pretty early on, back when it was just Connor Boyack running this. I actually did some writing for them just on a volunteer basis. I've always been very liberty-minded. I think I read Ayn Rand way too young when I was 10 or so, and it was very formative for me. And so just the concept of personal liberty is pretty deeply ingrained in me, and I wanted to be part of making Utah more free. I'm a native of Utah, and it's such a conservative state. It should be more free than it is. And so I wanted to, make it better.
I have these conversations all the time about how we're in a conservative state where everyone says they love free markets, and Mormons who, are very pro agency and everything like that. So you'd think we would be better, but here we are. It's still relatively good.
It is. I think a lot of it, though, comes down to we get complacent. We think because everyone thinks like us, then that's what the legislature's doing. That must be what our laws look like and our legal framework look like. And that doesn't always pan out. And I think we need to be less complacent and really we owe it to ourselves and our families and everyone else to be informed, and probably more informed than we generally tend to be.
Right. And I think that's a good segue into kind of the whole topic of this episode, which has to do with something that I think a lot of people would be surprised to find out about, that we're working on in Utah with our conservative religious legislature, which is the issue of psychotherapy, or psychedelics, as many people know it. Can you explain, for those who might not be familiar, what is psychotherapy and why does that matter here in Utah?
Okay, so the concept of psychotherapeutics is, we've probably all heard the term psychedelics, right? That applies to psychoactive substances like LSD or MDMA or psilocybin. But psychotherapeutics really refers to using those same psychoactive substances, but in a medical or a therapeutic way, right? Not just for recreational purposes, not just because you want to go on a trip, but because you're really seeking you're mindfully and purposefully seeking some mental health benefits. And that's really been supported by a lot of scientific literature that these substances can be very effective. And that is so important for Utah because we have some of the highest rates we have the highest mental illness rates in the nation and some of the highest suicide rates, especially among young adults. And our veteran suicide rate, it's also above average. I mean, we really have a problem here in Utah. And I think it's incumbent upon us to not just, wring our hands and say, what was me, but to actually do something about that. And making psychedelics available to people in a medical setting can be a big part of that solution.
Yeah, and I think I really like that you highlighted just how Utah in particular has a really big issue with opioids and just prescription drug abuse. So it's interesting that we're finally getting to talk about this new alternative. Now, is there, I know that a lot of the work you've done has been with gathering information and just kind of helping inform people as far as like how effective and how powerful these psychedelics really can be as far as, whether it's addiction, whether it's mental health, suicide issues, like do you know off the top, do you have numbers off the top of your head about just like what the success rate is and how like helpful these alternative medicines can be?
Yeah, so I mean, it varies by substance, the studies that have been done on it. I've mostly worked on psilocybin because that's what we want to legalize for medical purposes here in Utah. But with psilocybin, what they're seeing is people who try it, like a majority of them are experiencing relief from their depression or for their end of life anxiety. And it's persisting. Those good effects are persisting like months out. Like so far they've looked at 6 months out, right? And they'll continue to do follow-ups as time progresses. But that's amazing because when you think about like an SSRI or a benzodiazepine or something like that, we're talking about a pill that you're taking every day, and it might, usually there's kind of people might get some relief, and then usually the benefits decrease over time. And instead we're seeing something that people take once or twice and then they're better like indefinitely, which is pretty amazing.
Yeah, and that's really, I think that's one of the big like differences is it's not something that you just constantly have to do. It's not like a regular part of your routine, and you don't get hooked onto it. You can't get hooked to these kinds of substances, contrary to popular belief. I want to take a second to help people understand who maybe those you mentioned a little bit as who are the recipients, who are the people that are using psychotherapy and benefit from it, because I think a lot of the stigma we're having to deal with is like, we're usually thinking it's hippies, we're thinking it's people that just like want to go on trips and stuff. But who are some of the folks that, like the stories that you've come across here in Utah of people that are actually benefiting from it?
That's a great question. And maybe I'll just premise this with, I myself am not super into like I don't go to the doctor very often. I had all my babies naturally. Like I don't use caffeine. I don't take aspirin. Like I don't like I'm very conservative about what I put in my body. And so I'm very skeptical of kind of like any medical treatment. And yet I'm thoroughly convinced after talking to people that this is the real deal. I've talked to, like, one of the stories that stands out to me is a man named Eric who was a pilot in the Air Force. He ended up having to take a medical retirement because he had this inner ear disease. And he was just really depressed after that. His career had been cut short. He was leaving the military. He'd also, been kind of had some of that PTSD from serving tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, and was just really depressed. He tried the typical medical routes. He got an SSRI. He got a diagnosis of PTSD and anxiety. But nothing, he did therapy and it just wasn't working. And this is like a really conservative guy. He's like married, he's got 4 kids, like just your typical middle-aged dad. But he got to the point that he was like, I need, the status quo is not working, and tried some psilocybin, and it was just life-changing for him. And, this isn't some like crazy hippie living off in the woods. He's just like the most typical conservative kind of dad you could imagine. And here he was, just telling me about this life-changing experience with psilocybin. Or I can think of another woman, just like your typical mom, stay-at-home mom. She'd had some traumatic things happen to her, like her dad had been murdered, and then she was diagnosed with Hashimoto's. And again, she was just kind of in this really negative place, very depressed, just trying to deal with all this. And again, tried psilocybin and was able to kind of just put all of that in perspective and work through it and get to a much better place after trying psilocybin. And I think that's one of the amazing things about psilocybin and psychotherapeutics in general, is that it's not just trying to like numb your pain. It's not just trying to mask it. It's making your brain temporarily more plastic. So you're not just putting a Band-Aid on something, you're working through it, but in a healthy way. And you're making these new patterns in your brain, like you're actually forming new neural pathways in your brain. So instead of being stuck in this negative rut, you can think about things from a new perspective. So yeah, a lot of people who are just regular Joes are already trying this, and the anxiety they have from trying something illegal, it's just really sad to me, because desperate, they don't want to break the law. They're otherwise very, very normal law-abiding citizens. But they get to the point that they're desperate enough to do this, and it just makes me sad thinking of how many other normal people there are out there who could benefit, who aren't willing to look at this or try this because it's illegal.
Yeah, and what's unfortunate too, because and maybe you mentioned this earlier, but the process at which we're working on it in Utah is legalizing it for like a clinical setting, a medicinal setting, right? Kind of similar to medical marijuana. It's not just going to be all across the board recreational. This is going to be a very controlled environment, professional setting for folks that need to go and like be guided and helped in a controlled environment. Is that pretty accurate?
That's exactly accurate, and I'm really glad you brought that up, because in a lot of ways it's more controlled than cannabis. Right now with cannabis, you go get a recommendation from your doctor, you fill that prescription at a pharmacy, and then you take that cannabis home with you, right? And people can use that responsibly, or there's a potential for people to use that irresponsibly, right? You could potentially use it and then drive or something like that, just like you could with any medicine, right? People done things on lots of prescription medications. But this, you're going to go to your doctor or your prescriber, get a recommendation, and then you're going to use it with a licensed therapist who's had specialized training. And that's just because while you're under the influence of psilocybin or another psychedelic, in a very vulnerable space. And we want to make sure that people are safe while they're using it, and also that they have the support and guidance to make the most of that experience, right? Your brain's plastic. Let's have a professional there to help you make those new neural pathways in a healthy way, instead of, some of these people I've talked to who are using it on their own are like locking themselves in their bathroom alone. And I mean, like, that's just not an ideal way to try to rewrite your brain, right?
Mm-hmm. And that's a really, I feel like that's one of the things that people don't understand or fully grasp about keeping this substance illegal and control, like heavily controlled, to the point that you can't just go and seek medical help. It ends up causing people to have to do it by themselves, figure out, find a supplier, and go through the whole process of like the stress and anxiety of finding someone that can provide it for you. And then also they don't know what the quality is. Like, you don't know if there's going to be issues. And then another big thing is, and maybe you can explain a little more detail to this, is this isn't for everyone. Like, it's not being said that like, oh, this is, the treatment and cure for every single person. There's an important process of making sure like whoever is going to seek this kind of medical help is in a right, like they have all the right factors, and making sure that there's no prior history or medical or mental, I guess like health history that could cause further problems by using psilocybin. Is that fair to say? With like the clinical setting, they actually can make sure like, oh, you're not, we would not recommend this for you, versus someone who's just going to go find out firsthand experience that maybe it was not a good idea.
Yeah, so there's a lot to unpack there. So first of all, the way this bill is, where you have to go to a medical professional to have it prescribed, there's going to be a screening process, right? They're going to make sure that like you don't have a heart condition or something that would contraindicate that this is good for you. And that makes it sound scarier than it is, because psilocybin especially like is incredibly safe, and we can hopefully come back to that a little later. But there is going to be a screening process, right? To make sure that this is a good fit, that it's actually going to help you with the problems you're having, that we're not just giving it out like candy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then to your point about people using this without support, when I was a prosecutor, I saw a lot of drug cases, and most of them had to do with methamphetamine and heroin are the biggest ones that were, where people were having their lives destroyed, and we're seeing a lot of problems. I only had a few cases where people possessed psilocybin, and one of the ones that was really saddest to me was this young college kid. He wanted to use some. He was kind of trying to be responsible, and he invited an acquaintance to kind of come supervise him while he used psilocybin. But obviously she had no training. He had no training. No one knew what they were doing, right? And he ended up, like, while he was kind of under the influence of psilocybin, trying to assault her, and she had to, just leave. And that would never have happened, right? If you were in a clinical setting and you had, the proper preparation and you had the proper supervision. And so I think the danger we see is from people trying to go it alone, when this is a tool, right? It's a tool, not a toy. My kids all the time, like when they're using knives or something, toy. And it's a powerful tool, and it can of course be misused, but it can be super beneficial if we just use it in the right way. And right now we're making it very difficult for people to use it in the right way.
Right. And I mean, it's the same application with prescription drugs. Like, they can be a tool if you use them the right way, but you can also very much abuse them and use it the wrong way and have very dire consequences. And I mean, this would be an appropriate time, I guess, to go further a little bit into the safe, like how safe really psilocybin and these kind of substances are. I mean, they're obviously, everything has a risk, everything, in moderation, yada, yada. But there's definitely a false image associated with the dangers of these kinds of substances. And I think this would be a good time if you want to, explain a little more into really how safe they actually are.
Yeah, so there's, several components of safety. I think the first one that's easiest to address is like the toxicity, right? Like, you can overdose on methamphetamine and die. You can overdose on heroin and die. You cannot overdose on psilocybin and die. There's like literally never been a human who has died from taking too much psilocybin. And people have done studies on mice. And if you give them pure psilocybin, not like a mushroom that contains some psilocybin, but pure psilocybin, you have to give them 300 milligrams per kilogram of body weight for them to die. And to put that in perspective, when they're doing studies on people to treat depression or something like that, they're giving them like 20 to 50 milligrams total, right? For like a couple 100-kilogram person or so basically I ran the math, and it's lawyer math, so I could be off a little, but a 150-pound person would need about 21,000 milligrams of pure psilocybin to kill them, if the overdose rates hold true between mice and humans. And so to put that in further perspective, if I go to Costco and I buy like a tub of dried porcinis, I would have to like 3 of those and eat all of them, and they would have to be like psilocybin mushrooms for me to die. So like, it's impossible to take a toxic, lethal dose of psilocybin. And then another aspect of safety is the psychological safety, right? People are worried, like, am I gonna go crazy? Am I gonna lose my mind? And a lot of that stemmed from anecdotes of people who had like done psilocybin and then, developed schizophrenia later or something. But in studies, when they've unpacked this, they found that like the rate of people who develop schizophrenia who have used psilocybin versus people who just develop schizophrenia anyway, it's the same rate, right? So saying that psilocybin caused their schizophrenia is like saying that, someone ate peanut butter and then they developed schizophrenia, right? There's not a causal link. And sure, when we're trying to figure out what caused this, it's easy to jump to something like that, but the numbers do not bear out not only do they not bear out causality, they don't even bear out that there's a correlation between increasing, the risk of developing a serious mental illness like schizophrenia if you use psilocybin. So that's a long, very safe. And another metric you could use to look at safety. One of my favorites is a study done by a man named Nutt, who's in the UK, and they took like all these psychoactive substances, like 20 of them, and they had a panel of experts, who worked in the substance abuse and mental health arenas, kind of rank the social harm and the harm to the individual, right, from using these substances. And the most dangerous substance was alcohol, because it gets misused constantly and causes, harm to that person, harm to the people around them. Maybe they commit crimes or they're violent when they drink alcohol. And then on the other end of the spectrum was psilocybin, was the most safe, because people just did not see it causing harm to the people using it or causing harm to others around them. And so I think that really puts in perspective what you were saying about anything can be misused, right? Anything used, we see things that are already prescribed commonly being misused. You talked about the opioid epidemic, but no one's saying that we should ban opioids, right? Because we know they have really powerful, legitimate uses, even though they can be misused. And I think the same applies to psychotherapeutics.
Oh yeah, no, I didn't know a lot of those details you just mentioned, from the numbers showing that there's no correlation or causation kind of a thing, and then up to this study. Like, that's all new to me, and that's really, really cool to hear. And we've actually done we've in Utah had some of our own like numbers and studies done, because last year there was the lawmakers passed a task force and like assigned a specific group of people to study throughout the year. I think it was from the beginning of 2022 up until October is more or less when they described they were going to do all the research, and then they were going to put out a report, so that way we could actually see what the evidence is. And maybe you could explain a little bit about what that whole process was here in Utah, particularly with that task force.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up. So in 2022, the legislature passed a bill creating a task force. And that task force really was like a who's who of mental health professionals here in Utah. I mean, we had people from the U of U and their mental health program. We had people from the state hospital. We had people from kind of all the government bodies that oversee substance abuse and mental health. We had legal professionals, and all these people came together to look at the science behind psychotherapeutics. And they mostly focused their research, I guess, on MDMA and psilocybin, just because that's what there's the most research on. And they were very, very conservative in their methodology. So even though there have been literally thousands of papers written on this, they limited their study to cases where there had been, two arms, like there was a placebo control, and that they were, recent studies. So they really only looked at the really high quality studies. And their conclusion at the end of all that was that psilocybin is a safe and effective therapy to treat for treatment-resistant depression and for depression and anxiety associated with life-threatening diagnoses. That psilocybin is safe. It has no risk of dependence, no confirmed cases of overdose, and that they thought that in addition to using it for depression and anxiety, it would be worth looking into whether it should be allowed for obsessive compulsive disorder, eating disorders, alcohol abuse, and chronic pain, because there's some research on that too. And then with regard to MDMA, they found that it's effective to treat PTSD, and it's safe as long as you administer it in a therapeutic setting. And that when you're taking it as you're directed, it doesn't lead to addiction, it doesn't lead to dependence. And they also thought that a compassionate use board should be considered to treat additional conditions, not just PTSD. So really, we have like all these experts looking at the science and concluding that, yeah, like this stuff is safe, it has a benefit, and we should really be looking into it.
Yeah, and what's so cool is like you were just explaining that there's been tons of studies, papers all across the world, but like we took the time to do one of our own here in Utah. So like we went in the extra mile and said, okay, let's find out for ourselves. And sure enough, seems that we've proved, just like many of the other studies, that this is a good solution. This is good policy. This is a way to actually really help people and get at the root of all these issues that we were talking about. Um, Now, shortly after that task force had put out their report and everything, I think it was more or less in that time because it was near the end of the year. You held a panel discussion or helped host a panel discussion in Salt Lake City with a few different people to talk about, from a medical background, from a personal use background, from a veterans background, just kind of the help people see and hear the stories of who these Utahns are that are so passionately supportive of this issue. Do you want to take a second to talk a little bit about that panel that you were a part of and helped run?
Yeah, sure. That panel discussion, it was great because we had Reed Robison, who is a practicing psychiatrist here in Utah, who's interested and very well informed about psychotherapeutics. We had Allison Fiducia, who's a published researcher in this field. And then we had a couple of patients who had used a psychotherapeutic, and they just sort of shared their personal stories, and we combined that with, the insights from people who are in the field. And Reed, Dr. Robison, I was really struck by how he emphasized the need for this in Utah. I mean, he's a psychiatrist. He sees this every day. He works at a ketamine clinic. Ketamine is also, some people consider it a psychotherapeutic or a psychedelic, which is legal. And so he tries to help people with that, but just his emphasis on how much this is a needed tool here and how desperate things are in Utah. And just, I think he speaks for a lot of providers in this space when they want to help patients, right? And they just feel hamstrung. They just don't have the tools to help them. And then Dr. Fiducia, I mean, she's pretty much dedicated her life to researching this, and she is very convinced that this is the way forward.
Yeah. And
oh, sorry, one thing about that panel before I forget. At one point, the moderator asked people in the audience, like, so how many of you have tried a psychotherapeutic? And I was amazed. I mean, like, this is a hall with, a couple hundred people in it, and like almost all of them raised their hands. So like, this is happening. It is happening whether or not it's legal, but we have an opportunity to make it safe, right? And right now, it's under the radar, and no one knows about the potency or the purity of what they're putting in their body.
Right. No, and I'm glad that you highlight that, because that was exactly what I was going to bring up, was looking at the audience and the turnout, because I was at that event as well. Looking at the turnout of it, the people who were in the crowd, the people who got up and asked questions and everything, like, these all looked like your regular neighbors. Like, it was nine times out of 10, it was somebody that just looked like a regular, average Joe on the street, your neighbor at church or something like that. It wasn't anything like, there was like a couple people that you would expect to see, but it was like one or two. It wasn't really this huge turnout of like, odd people and hippies and people just trying to push for, like, it was a really, really eye-opening setting. And seeing how many people, have personal experience with it. And then what struck me was hearing like the different folks get up to ask questions. And like, there was a mom I remember talking about her daughter, and that was like the most heartbreaking story, because she had all these issues, and she was, if they could just at least open the door to allow them to look into these options of psychotherapeutics, it would potentially probably change her daughter's life. And so hearing all these people, and the mother that was on the panel, she looked like just your typical like blonde Utah mom. Like, you wouldn't have known, hearing her story, that this is what she's doing, that she was using psychotherapeutics to help improve her quality of life. And one thing I like to talk to a lot of people about is, because in Utah, again, we're very conservative, very, proud of our police, proud of our military. And I always tell people, this is one of the most pro-military, pro-veteran, public servant folks. I mean, because you imagine all the things that law enforcement goes through, that they deal with, they see every day, that I used to study to be a paramedic, EMT. And so like the things that you see on that job, and like between all these different professions, it's just, nothing could be better and more supportive of those communities than opening a door like this to allow them to find, help and therapy, but in an effective way that will actually enable them to move forward and take control of their health again, so they're not constantly having to be weighed down by these, traumatic experiences. One thing that also wanted to help people understand, because you have the background of being a prosecutor, seeing firsthand the justice system, what's the damage that you've seen, because you highlighted a lot of the cases you dealt with were drug related. What would something like this, pushing for ending kind of this war on drugs and helping open the door for actual helping people rather than just prosecuting them, what's the big impact or the negative impact you've seen from the war on drugs here in Utah?
So again, a lot to unpack there. I think understanding how the war on drugs has worked in Utah, you have to understand how we actually prosecute drugs, right? So even if I get a conviction, if I convict someone of their fourth time possessing heroin or something, they're going to be sent, they're not going to go to jail. They're not going to go to prison. And if they do, it's going to be for like a very, very short time. What they are going to do is they're going to be put on probation and they're going to be ordered to do treatment. And from there are some people who have gone to treatment and it's worked for them, but I don't subscribe to the disease model of addiction. The disease model of addiction says you have a disease, you're sick, and you're going to be sick forever, and you're just going to relapse and need treatment the rest of your life. And I subscribe to the outgrowing addiction model, that when people have healthy sources of purpose and pleasure in their life, they get rid of that addiction on their own because they have something else in their life that fills that basic human need. And I saw so many people ordered to do treatment, and one, they almost never did it. And when they did do it, even when they did it, it didn't work, right? They'd complete their treatment and then they'd be right back in court. I mean, it was just this perverse merry-go-round, right? Like, we're all going through this same kabuki dance of, we'll send you to treatment as if that's going to cure you. And it doesn't, right? And I think the system knows it is not, like, the status quo is not working. And I don't think putting people in jail works either, right? You would have to put them in jail for a long time for them to even detox. And then they usually leave. And the first thing they do is they go right back to their addiction, right? Because they're craving it more than they ever have. So really, if we want people to stop using drugs, we don't want to disrupt their whatever family connections they have or whatever employment they have. We want them to have healthy sources of purpose and pleasure. And every time we prosecute them, we disrupt whatever they've built. And I just think, like, fundamentally, the cure to addiction cannot be provided by government, and it cannot be provided by forced treatment. And we're just wasting a ton of resources. And frankly, we're creating a lot of noise in the criminal justice system. So there's people who have addictions and are also causing a lot of harm to other people. Like, maybe they're breaking into cars, or they're stealing, or they're, violent. And what I saw is, if they also had anything in their record that they had a drug conviction, the judge would just order them to get treatment. It doesn't matter that you're stealing 5 cars. Go get drug treatment. That'll be the cure. It doesn't matter that, you beat your wife. Go get drug treatment, as if this is the answer to everything. And it's not, right? And if we could just clean out the drug war stuff and focus on the crimes that are actually hurting people and how to address those, I think we'd see a lot better results in our criminal justice system as a whole.
And it is, I mean, to be fair, like we've been talking, like, it's not like, any of these psychedelics should be even compared to some of the more addictive substances, but that's how bad it is with those substances. And so to treat something like this that actually really has a overall positive impact on people, to make criminals out of them for it, making criminals out of, like, average everyday people, and like, it doesn't make sense. And it's really heartbreaking once you start to see the real stories of who these people are. Now, we've already talked a little bit about the difference of, like, this is clinical and everything. There have been other states that have decriminalized or passed similar legislation or something along similar lines of legalizing psychedelics. But maybe it would help people just to understand maybe the difference between what we're doing in Utah versus, say, I think Colorado did something, and I think also, was it Washington or Oregon, one of those states, they also did some similar work with psychedelics. What's unique about Utah versus those ones?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we are kind of seeing a movement to legalize psychotherapeutics. Several cities throughout the US have not legalized it because they can as a city, but they've basically deprioritized it. They've told their police, just don't enforce those laws anymore. And then Oregon, they have both legalized possession of all drugs, and they created a framework to use it medicinally. Um, but that barely went live this year. And it's pretty highly regulated, and it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, and if people choose to go that route, or if they still use it without support, just because it looks like it might be very costly to participate in their market because it's become so regulated. And then Colorado, just this last November, legalized the possession of I think it was psilocybin and ibogaine and mescaline, a lot of these plant-based psychedelics. And so you can possess them, you can grow them, you can give them away or trade them, but you can't sell them. And that's for people who are 21 and older. And then New York actually just dropped a bill that they're trying to pass that would also looks very similar to Colorado. But what's different about Utah is we're not just going whole hog all at once, right? We're not just saying that it's legal for anyone to use it. We're saying it's legal if you go to your doctor and your doctor says it's safe for you, and you're using it in this therapeutic setting with, being supervised by a licensed, trained therapist. And so I think we're taking a very conservative and measured approach that's going to prevent a lot of excesses, right? It's only going to be used in a very specific setting with a lot of guardrails in place. And talking about guardrails, Utah legalized the medical use of cannabis a couple of years ago. And I think we've done a very good job of putting in place guardrails that allow patients to access it, but the police can still do their job of watching the, checking the recreational use of it. And so we have something to build on, right? We've done this before with one thing, we can do it again. And we have the framework in place to roll it out pretty efficiently, I think.
Yeah. It's just exciting to think that, like, here in Utah, we're actually talking about legalizing psychedelics to any degree. I mean, when I talk to friends and family about it, they definitely are surprised. They're caught off guard because it's gaining popularity, but it's still new to people. It's still something that every day, someone is learning about, because it's not quite, it's becoming mainstream enough that, like, states are passing things and trying to change the landscape, but there's still enough people that are new to this that it's exciting to share this information and see their eyes light up when they realize, like, oh wow, I didn't know that we actually have a potential solution to so many of the major issues that we deal with today. That's what's so important, I would say, about it, is that, like, today, I mean, we've always had issues. Mental health has always been something that existed, like, struggles with it and addiction and all the things that we've talked about. But it seems like today it's become so prominent in society. So many people, so many young people especially, struggle with these issues. And for Utah to be able to come out and be like, hey, we have an actual approach, there's guardrails, it's a proven system, and, like, we can roll this out and actually change lives, is just, I never thought I'd see the day that we see Utah lawmakers talking about this. And so on that point, when it comes to the lawmakers and the people that are dealing with this issue of legalizing it, what's your feelings towards this bill being introduced in this session? Do you feel like there's been a lot of good reception from lawmakers? Do you feel like it's still kind of up in the air? What do you feel like you're expecting to see?
I will say that I am tentatively hopeful. We've had a lot of conversations with, different representatives and leadership, and for the most part, like, they're very receptive, especially once you give them a little bit of information, right? Because like you're explaining to people, like, wait, what is this? A lot of people, it's not on their radar. But once they understand that this is really supported by quite a lot of science and that it can really make a difference for people with mental illnesses, they're very supportive. And one of the things that surprised me most is I've, put out feelers to various like law enforcement groups and prosecution groups, and, are they going to hate this? And what I've uniformly heard from them is like, as long as we know what's legal and what's not, and we can do our jobs, we're fine with this. We don't want to get in between patients and their doctors. So if this is being used in a medical way, like we want people to have access to that. So that was kind of pleasantly surprising to me that
Yeah,
it's being received as warmly as it is.
that's really good to hear. So what can, I guess, to wrap this all up and put a nice bow on it, what can people do, just regular listeners, no one who's people who aren't involved in the process or even necessarily like aware of how the legislative process works, what can they do if they're interested in getting behind this, showing support? Is there somewhere they can go, someone they can talk to help push this in the right direction?
Um, I would say probably the most valuable thing you can do is just contact your state senator, your state representative. And I know that sounds cheesy, but I worked in a state representative's office up in Oregon, ran their office for a while. And when you get a letter from someone in your district, a constituency, that legislator told me, like, I know for every letter I get that there are dozens, if not hundreds of people who feel the same way. So the people who take time to actually write to me, like, I know this represents a lot of people. And so they're going to hear from a lot of lobbyists on the Hill. They're going to hear from a lot of organized groups, but getting letters from people who actually live in their district actually makes a big difference, and just lets them know, like, this isn't something that I need to be scared of, that my constituents are going to hate, like, that they're open to this. I think gives them the freedom to feel like they can move forward with this and they're not going to have kind of like political repercussions.
Yeah, it's cool because your state, like, you can actually, like you said, talk to these people. A lot of times we get caught up in the national federal politics, which is just a whole other beast and just kind of a shit show. So it's a lot easier to actually talk to your representatives and have your voice heard on like local issues in your state. Now, if someone doesn't know who their senator is, they don't know like who is their representative, how can they find that out?
Great question. So there's several ways to just look it up online. If you go to the legislative website, they've got a little map tool. You can like even click on where you live and it'll tell you who your senator or your representative are. Or libertas.org. We've got our own website and you can look up, you can track bills there as well as look up legislators there.
Okay, so they can go in, put their information, find out who their legislator is, and then they can also, if they're interested, follow this bill along with any other things that the organization is tracking. So that's,
yes.
I'll make sure to drop that link in like the show notes and everything so people can find it. Lastly, if someone's interested in learning more about just the topic of psilocybin, of psychedelics, psychotherapy, what would you recommend someone who's new to this? Where should they go? What should they read, watch? Like, what's the best way for them to become more informed in a healthy way?
I think Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind, is a really good place to start. It's very accessible. It's also kind of summarizes a lot of the studies and science behind it. And there's also a Netflix documentary, I think by the same name, How to Change Your Mind, that's also just a really good starting point if you want to kind of increase your broad-based knowledge of psychotherapeutics.
Okay, sweet. And then there's also, you just recently put out a policy brief, just kind of summarizing the topic, right? They can also find that on the website, the Libertas website. Is that correct?
Absolutely, and it's got a million footnotes if you are hungry for more, or you can just read the body of the policy brief if you just want an overview.
Okay, awesome. Is there anything else before I let you plug all of your ways for people to follow your work? Is there anything else you'd like to bring up? Any other things you'd like to talk about before we wrap up?
I would just encourage people to follow the science, right? We should inform our public policy based on the best data we have, and we have a lot of good data about this. So even if maybe this is kind of new to you or something you're unfamiliar with, like I'd encourage you to just go out there and follow the science and see where it leads you, because I think that you can't go wrong.
Yeah, no, especially with this. This is very, it seems to be clearly every day that goes by just becoming more and more obvious that this is a good thing and we should be approaching it this way and helping more people find this as a solution. So, if anyone wants to reach out to you, follow your work, where can they find you?
So I'm probably easiest to find on Twitter at Libertas Pomeroy, or you can also find me on Facebook, Amy Pomeroy.
Okay, perfect. Well, if if you're all set, there's nothing else to add. I think I've asked all the questions that I usually deal with when I talk to people. So I think we can wrap there. And thank you so much for your time and just helping make this something. We'll make this a reality for Utahns. It's really exciting and really hoping to see a positive outcome from this session this year. So
Thanks for having me on, and I hope that in a couple months we can talk later about how it passed and how it's changing lives.
yeah, definitely. That would be super fun to do a follow up and just see what's come of it. So, well, thank you everyone for tuning in to another episode, the first one of being back, and we'll see if I can do a better job at being consistent and having as exciting guests. But until next time, thanks and take care.